Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon and welcome to this webinar about the future of invoicing. We believe that the future of invoicing is electronic invoicing. So it's a new way of sending and receiving invoices. Today we will talk about what electronic invoicing is, why it is important, and how you can embrace it. Now you may wonder why we have this webinar right now. Why is this a relevant topic right now? We see that the landscape of electronic invoicing and the way how businesses send and receive invoices is changing rapidly. And because this rapid change, businesses have to make important decisions on how to embrace electronic invoicing. And we see in practice that businesses struggle with this. What decisions do they need to make to adopt electronic invoicing and to start using it? We talked to a business recently who embraced electronic invoicing. They integrated an e-invoicing solution for them, and after 2 years, they made the conclusion that this was not the provider they were looking for, and they could not realize their ambitions. And they had a lot of cost and a lot of frustrated suppliers because of a relatively simple mistake they made. And we want to prevent businesses from making such mistakes that are costly, not only in money, but also in terms of the frustrated suppliers, etc. So we want to help business navigate the e-invoicing landscape. Now, just before we start the webinar, a number of housekeeping remarks. First, if you have any questions during this webinar, you can use the question section in GoToWebinar. There is a question mark on your right-hand side. If you push that button, you have the ability to ask questions to us. My colleague Patty Outhoff will moderate questions and make sure that your questions will be answered accordingly. The slides of this webinar will be made available after the webinar. And also we will record this webinar so that we can distribute it later as a movie. So let's go right into it. And before we start, I would like to briefly introduce myself. My name is Jaap-Jan Nienhuis. I'm working for tradeinterop, and tradeinterop is an e-invoicing service provider. We help businesses connect their ERP, accounting, financial software to the financial software of their suppliers and buyers. And we do that by offering a cloud-based technology, so you don't have to install things on your own servers. It's fully cloud-based. We've been doing that for a couple of years, for 6 years, and we currently have more than 3,000 customers who use our technology to send and receive electronic invoices. Now again, my colleague Patty Outhoff is also in the call. She will help me moderate this webinar and make sure that any questions you will be answered. We also have 2 colleagues from the Edge Consulting Group in this call. Anupam, can I give the floor to you?
Thanks, Jaap-Jan. Hi, everybody. I'm Anupam Bansal. I'm a partner with the Edge Consulting Group. Edge Consulting Group is the partner for tradeinterop solutions in the United Kingdom. As Jaap-Jan had mentioned, they have over 3,000 customers in the Netherlands and in Europe, in continental Europe, and we thought it was good for bringing that solution to the United Kingdom. As a consulting group, we can help the customers understand, implement, and use e-invoicing. We can help you navigate both the payments and billing landscape, including e-invoicing and e-procurement, and to make the most out of e-invoicing. And without further ado, I give the floor back to Jaap-Jan. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Anupam, for that introduction. So let's dive into the primary topics of today. We would like to discuss 3 things. The first is, what is electronic invoicing and how has invoicing developed in the past years from mainly manual paperwork to fully automated touchless processes? And secondly, why is it important for you? Why is it relevant right now? And what drives electronic invoicing and the developments behind it? And how should you respond? What actions can you take tomorrow to embrace electronic invoicing and to prevent the potential mistakes that I told about earlier? So let's dive into these 3 topics. Now let's start with looking at how invoicing happens in the past and even today. Sometimes invoicing is done like this. So there's an employee at the financial department that enters data into an ERP or an accounting software, and that data is stored in the software, and then the software creates a PDF invoice, sometimes even a paper invoice, but in most cases creates a PDF invoice, and this PDF invoice is sent via email to the receiver. Now the receiver has to manually enter it into their systems. Sometimes they partly automate that process by using scanning software to enter it into the system, but still it is an error-prone process, and a lot of errors are made in either the scanning part or the manual entry part. But at the end, the invoice ends up in the procurement software or financial software or ERP software of the receiver, and it's processed further. So this is the process that happens today, and if you look at timelines, the entire process takes between 5 and 30 days. And there's been a lot of research in the cost of processing paper invoices, and with very different outcomes. But in general, the cost of processing paper or PDF invoices is estimated between 10 and 80 pounds per invoice. Now, to give you an indication, we talked to a Dutch government institution a while ago, and they estimated their total cost of processing one single invoice to be 110 euros. So there's a huge cost base and cost saving potential in moving away from paper-based processes. Now, this is all as we have used to do invoicing in the past. But imagine if we would rethink such processes with the internet in mind, in an era where we do basically everything via the internet. How would invoicing look like, and how would the internet transform traditional invoicing processes? Now, we think it would look like this. There's still the financial employee who enters data into his financial system, ERP system, CRM system, whatever system he uses. And then rather than creating a PDF invoice, that invoice data is straight submitted from the ERP system via the internet to the system of the receiver. And that can be procurement software, that can be financial software, but there's no manual typing or scanning of invoices to get the invoice into the procurement software. It is a straight connection between the ERP software of the supplier and the ERP software or procurement software of the buyer. And rather than 5 to 30 days, this entire process is done 5 to 30 seconds. So it's a lot faster. And because there's no manual processing in between, the risk of errors and the handling costs are much smaller. So this is how invoicing will look like in the future, and more businesses today start to migrate to this invoicing process. Now, it's interesting to see how this new invoicing process evolved over time in the past, let's say 20 years, and how business software responded to these developments. And we see typically business software evolving across 4 different phases. And the first phase is what we call closed platforms. Now, a closed platform is a ERP or financial solution that you use to send and receive invoices, but the data in that solution remains in that solution. There's no way to get the data out of such a closed platform. And the only way to get it out is by manually entering it in other systems. So these are closed platforms, and you can imagine that the big problem with closed platforms is that it is very difficult to get data out of it. And electronic processes are very difficult to realize with such closed platforms. Now, the good news is that there are less and less closed platforms. Basically, all the accounting software, e-invoicing software, ERP software move away from being closed platforms towards more open platforms. And the first open platforms we saw were EDI platforms. So with EDI platforms, it became possible for financial software to exchange their data via EDI platforms with their customers and their suppliers. Now, EDI was a quite complex technology, and it was expensive to use and to integrate, and that is the reason that you basically see EDI solutions only in supply chains with very high volumes. It's only used with high volume of invoices and other trading documents. Now, the next evolutionary phase for such bookkeeping and financial software was API platforms. And this is probably what you recognize, that more and more software enable you to connect, for example, your CRM software with your ERP software using APIs. Now, the big advantage of using APIs is that the technology is much simpler to integrate than EDI. So it becomes already easier to integrate your accounting software with the software of your suppliers, but still it requires, for example, your ERP software to implement APIs with your accounting software and vice versa. So there's still integration going on in this area. And what we see is that this integration is often done based on UBL, but it is not very standardized. Now, would it not be great if all these bookkeeping software, financial software, ERP software would sit together and create one single API that is the same for everyone? Wouldn't that make life a lot easier? That is exactly what Peppol is. So Peppol is a development that started in Europe but is now used globally, that connects all the ERP and financial software providers in a very easy and low-cost way. Now, we will talk about what Peppol is in a minute, so we will dive into that, but I would first like to see what the implications of each of these evolutionary stages are for you as a company. So if you use a closed platform, what is the implication of that if you want to move to e-invoicing? Now, if you look at this picture, imagine you're a supplier and you have a buyer who wants to move into electronic invoicing, but you have a closed platform. Then the only way to get your data into the system of the buyer is by manually entering it into the supplier portal. Now, some of you may recognize this because I know many businesses in the UK have, at the end of the month, they have to log in to a supplier portal of one of their customers and manually enter their invoices there. Now, if you have just 5 invoices for that customer, it's no problem. You can manually enter them. But if you have 500 invoices per month, then it becomes a pain. Now, and it even becomes a bigger pain if you do not have one customer who wants an electronic invoice, but other customers also require electronic invoices. So we know companies in the UK that have people dedicated at the end of the month to log into different portals and manually create their invoices there in order to make sure that their invoices are being paid. So this is if you have a closed platform. Now, again, closed platforms aren't used very much. And more platforms are moving towards more open platforms, API or EDI, or even Peppol. Now, what happens if your platform can integrate with the different supplier portals that your buyer uses? So it looks like this. Your software has the ability to connect to different software packages used by your customer. And you still need to integrate your software, but you can create your invoices in your own software and they are submitted or sent to the software of your buyer. So it's already a step up. Now you may wonder, what if your software is not connected and has not the ability to exchange data to other platforms? Now, the last model that I discuss in this respect is the Peppol model. So your software connects to the Peppol network. Via the Peppol network, you can send invoices to any other network, any other software in the Peppol network. So you don't need to do new integrations. If you have a new supplier, it is just routed through the Peppol network to the appropriate platform the buyer is using. Now, again, if your software is not connected to the Peppol network, that's not a problem at all, because there are many service providers who are in the business of connecting your software to the Peppol network. And this is exactly one of the things tradeinterop does. If your software is not yet connected to the Peppol network, is not yet able to send and receive electronic invoices via the Peppol network, then a company such as tradeinterop can do that. Okay, I see we have a question. So yeah, if you use a closed platform, can you still connect to the Peppol network is the question. So I just talked about what if your software is not connected to the Peppol network, then there's still a solution to connect to the Peppol network. But what if your software is closed? Can you then still connect to the Peppol network? And in principle, the answer is no, because in a closed platform, you cannot get data out of it. Now, there are exceptions to this rule. We have, for some customers who still use a closed platform, a legacy system, we have been able to get data out of it, but you have to do a couple of tricks to do that. For example, for one of the customers, we tap into the printer stream to get structured data out of the printer flow and create an electronic invoice out of that and send it to the Peppol network. So the answer is in principle no, but there are creative solutions to still do it. And if you want to know more about it, feel free to contact us. We can explore if that is one of the possibilities for you. So we talked a couple of times now about Peppol, and I said that Peppol is a way to send and receive electronic invoices between software packages, accounting, ERP, etc. But what exactly is Peppol? Now, there's one important thing I want to make clear here. Peppol is not a computer somewhere on the internet that processes all this invoice data. Peppol is a standard which defines how an e-invoice looks like. For example, where in this standard do we put an invoice number? Where do we put the amount excluding VAT? And where do we put an amount including VAT, etc.? So it's a standard about how can we exchange an invoice. At the same time, it is also a protocol, because you can create a standardized invoices in one software package, but you still need to send it in a secure and a reliable way to the receiving software. That's also a protocol that Peppol caters for. And thirdly, it is what we call a governance framework. So what Peppol does, it creates a trust network between e-invoicing providers, financial software packages, in such a way that we know, for example, that if you receive an invoice via the Peppol network from a specific company, then you are absolutely sure that it is that company who sent it. So within Peppol, it is not possible, or at least very difficult. You never should say it's not possible. It's very, very difficult to send fake invoices. So that's what the governance does, a set of rules about how can we trust each other on that we act on the rules that we have agreed on in this network. And to be very clear, these rules apply to service providers and software packages. So your accounting software should adhere to these rules. So you don't have to worry about them. So a standard, a protocol, and a governance framework. Peppol is active in 34 countries today. Most of these countries are European countries, but it's also being used in the UK by the NHS. It's being used in the United States and Canada, Australia, South Africa, Japan. Some countries are quite mature in the use of Peppol. Other countries are now rolling it out, but the technology is available in many countries and is expanding also. Now, if you look at the use of Peppol, it is currently mandated by a number of government bodies in the EU. That means that EU government institutions require their supplier to send in their invoices electronically via Peppol. So if you are a UK supplier to a government institution somewhere in the EU, then the chances are big that you need to send these invoices via the Peppol network. And there are even talks now within the EU of making Peppol the mandatory standard and protocol for exchanging invoices between businesses among each other. That becomes a really strong driver of electronic invoicing. Now, Peppol is implemented by more than 490 software vendors, different categories ranging from ERP vendors, CRM vendors, financial software providers, e-invoicing providers, procurement providers, etc. So I understand we have a question. The question is, what is the UK market size of closed networks compared to non-closed network size in percentage? So my interpretation of the question is, how large is the part of the closed networks rather than the open network, the non-closed networks? And it's difficult to say, but what we do see is that most platforms that we encounter today are able to, in the UK, are able to exchange their data via other networks. So there are ways to get the data out of it. I don't have an exact percentage, but we have never seen a large UK software vendor that still has a closed system. That's something different than connected to Peppol. There are still companies not connected, UK financial software, ERP software not connected to the Peppol network themselves, but these solutions can be connected to the Peppol network by service providers such as tradeinterop. I hope this gives an answer to your question. Otherwise, feel free to post a follow-up question. So in the past few minutes, we talked about what electronic invoicing is, and we also talked about how important it is to have Peppol as a development on your radar screen, because adopting Peppol really makes it simpler for you to exchange your invoices electronically, and not only simpler, but also more cost effective. Now, in the next couple of slides, I want to discuss with you why this is important and what really drives the adoption of electronic invoicing in the market. There are 4 key drivers that make sure that businesses more and more move towards electronic invoicing. And the first is obvious, the financial benefit of it. So electronic invoicing eliminates a lot of manual work in the invoicing process, which lead to large cost savings. And that is the reason why especially large buying organizations are moving to electronic invoicing. And they want their suppliers to embrace it also. So there's the financial component. The next one is the technological driver. And the key of that driver is that the Peppol technology to build these secure on-the-fly connections between financial software solutions, ERP software solutions, is easy to implement and is available at low cost. And for service providers, this means that they can connect to the Peppol network and that it is simpler to connect the Peppol network than to create all kinds of their own APIs. So the technology is available. And even if you are a user of software that is not connected to the Peppol network, then you're able to use a third-party service provider such as tradeinterop to connect to Peppol. Then there are legal drivers, and I already explained a little bit about Europe, but also the NHS in the UK wants to receive their invoices via the Peppol network. Now, the NHS does not mandate it for all their suppliers, but they are ramping it up in the coming years. So we expect that suppliers of the NHS more and more will get this mandatory invoicing requirement from their customer. Now, if you are in the UK and you send invoices to governments in the EU, it's also mandatory, and there's a legal obligation to do it via the Peppol network. So there's a strong legal driver, and that legal driver becomes bigger also in the UK. And then the last one is a security driver. And because people realize that they want to move to electronic ways of doing business, then the question rises, how are we going to do that securely? Because I don't want to have my trading data in the open on the internet. So there's a need for secure ways and secure means of exchanging that data, rather than, for example, using email. And that requirement of security also drives the use of Peppol, because Peppol has intrinsically in its protocol and in its standard ways of checking the security, the authenticity of the invoice, and the integrity of the data in the invoice, etc. So these are 4 key drivers. The first driver is the financial one. I would like to briefly elaborate on it a bit more. So we have looked at one of our customers and compared the different invoicing processes they have. So they have a paper invoice process, and they have a number of steps they execute to handle paper invoices. And these steps are first handling, so they have to get the paper invoice out of the envelope, put it in the scanner, check if the invoice is basically an authentic invoice, check if the content is correctly recognized by the scanner if you use scanning software, or is correctly entered into the system by a human, basically. Then the invoice data need to be enriched and processed further. And with processing, I mean it goes into a workflow probably, and it goes into approval process and into your financial system. Now this case study, the company moved for a part of their invoices to PDF invoices, and basically there's a gain with that because you eliminate your handling of paper. So you don't need to get paper out of the envelope, but you still need to execute a scanning process. To check the authenticity of the invoice and to check if the content is correctly recognized or entered into the system. You have to enrich it and process it. But then the big advantage comes if you look at the e-invoicing process of that company, because they could eliminate additional steps. They could eliminate the scanning step and the authenticity step and the check of the content. And the reason they could eliminate it is that within the Peppol network, you know that if an invoice says, I'm coming from this company, then it really comes from that company. If an invoice says, we come from Shell, then it comes from Shell. So you're sure about the authenticity. You're also sure about the content. So the invoice is not scanned or interpreted by a system. Because there is a standard defined, the system knows exactly what the invoice contains, and you don't need to check if the system correctly interpreted, for example, amounts and order numbers and invoice lines, etc. So you can eliminate these processes. Now, enrichment partly remains the same, and the processing, of course, remains largely the same in the sense that the electronic invoicing still needs to be routed, get the appropriate approvals within the company, etc. But what we saw, if we compare the cost of processing these invoices, compare paper and electronic, you see that there's a cost saving potential of 67%. And this is a very conservative estimate because we know that this only takes into account the elimination of manual processes. But there are other cost benefits involved. So these 67% cost saving potential is only a tip of the iceberg, so to say. Now, again, there are a number of other benefits involved. Some are more hidden cost or potential hidden benefits. For example, the elimination of manual processing, we talked about that in the previous slide. The faster processing, so the processing of invoices takes place within, let's say, 5 seconds to 30 seconds. But also you make less errors, so you get less calls to your call centers. You have less cost of disputes, less late payment fees or missed early payment discounts. And we even talked some companies who execute double payments because they're not able to really get the controls in place on their paper invoicing process. And sometimes they execute payments twice. With electronic invoicing, it is much easier to prevent that from happening. And the last big benefit is that you don't need relatively expensive scanning and OCR solutions that are required in paper and PDF processes. So again, we talked about what electronic invoicing is. We talked about why it's important and what the drivers are. And really what we see today are there are not many companies who doubt the financial benefit and the cost saving opportunities of moving towards electronic invoicing. So there's a general consensus that it's really a large benefit And we see more and more companies also in the UK who are starting to use electronic invoicing. Now, how should you move forward and what should you do? We see that any electronic invoicing process requires a number of stakeholders that should be on board, and it's really important to have them on board. And we often categorize the internal stakeholders, buyers and suppliers, so basically your trading partners, and software providers. Now let's start with internal stakeholders. Why should you get your internal stakeholders on board? The reason is because you start to introduce a new way of working. And the new way of working doesn't have to be a drastically new way of working, but there's still new ways of working that affects your internal stakeholders. So it's good to have them on board. You have a new way of collaborating with your buyers and your suppliers. And to get them on board, it is good to talk to them early on. And probably you may need new tools. So you have to talk to your software provider about what are the capabilities of your software provider. Maybe it's already connected to the Peppol network, and if not, what new tools can you embrace and adopt to connect it to the Peppol network? So these are the stakeholders. Now let's dive into each of them a bit more. First, the internal stakeholders, and I will not go through them in very much details, but the most important internal stakeholders are finance, IT, and procurement. Why these three? Finance, because they are the business owner of and the owner of the potential benefits. So finance is the owner, and also often the department that runs the project. ICT, because of their technical expertise and because they often own the tools that you currently have within your organization, and they are an expert on the technical side of that. And procurement, because they have the supplier relations. So they talk to the suppliers, and if suppliers have questions, they talk to procurement. There's a story we encountered recently where the business owner really wanted all the suppliers to send their invoices electronically. But if the supplier had questions to the procurement department, and procurement said, well, you know, don't make a big problem out of it, just send PDFs to me and I will make sure that they are processed. So it's important to get finance, ICT, and procurement on board. Now, there may be other departments that you need to consider to take on board, such as a communications department. What communications are you doing? We will talk about that later on in this webinar. Now, if you have your internal stakeholders together, so finance, ICT, and procurement, there are a number of topics that you need to discuss with them. And we have a list of topics, but the three most important topics are these three. So the current situation, how many invoices do you have? How many suppliers do you have? What is the ICT landscape that is used to process your invoices? So you have to discuss that with both ICT and finance and your procurement department. But also, what is your objective? How much electronic invoices do you want to receive at what point in time? And how many suppliers do you have to take on board to achieve that objective? And how are you going to do that? It's also important to involve your ICT and your procurement department with that. And the third very important topic that's often missed is the process. What processes are impacted? So for example, how is the invoice approval process impacted by moving to electronic invoicing? And can we optimize or fine-tune these processes also? What does it do with your ordering process? Is it impacted? And if so, are there opportunities to fine-tune it? So this is the process part that you should discuss internally. Now, there are more points. If you're interested to know, we have a list of items that you need to discuss internally, and we also have tools how to discuss them internally. Let us know. We can provide you with more input. Another important topic for internal discussion is the business case. And I won't go in details about the business case, but there are a couple of steps that are important. And the first is, of course, you need to determine what your current costs are. And you can do that by calculating the number of people that are currently involved with the handling of invoices, with the execution of payments, the resolution of disputes, and your OCR solution. And you can estimate the cost for the coming years and the cost reduction for the coming years on each of these different categories. Now, you also have to take into account, of course, the integration cost that you have to do if any of your software vendor, your accounting software, is not yet connected to Peppol. You may need new tools, and these new tools may have additional cost. You have to take them into account. But that's about calculating the business case. Now, if you want to get started in calculating the business case, we have a free business case calculator tool. So let us know if you're interested to that. We can help you getting started in getting insight about what are the cost saving potential for you as an organization. We have another question. Yeah, a question about this business case tool. Can you tell more about it? I will be very brief. What it basically does is you provide a number of important parameters, such as what are your different suppliers, the largest suppliers, how many invoices do they send to you? And we basically create a business case based on an estimate of the number of invoices, your current number of FTE involved in processing these invoices, etc. So I won't go into too much detail. If you want to know more, I can send more information. We have a one-pager about this business case calculator, and I can send it if you want to. So back to the stakeholder management. So what stakeholders do you need to involve in your electronic invoicing process? We talked about the internal stakeholders. Now I'd like to talk about the software provider. So you need to talk to your e-invoicing provider or your accounting software, etc. Now, the first thing is you need to determine whether you need additional software or whether your existing software provider provides everything that you need. So that's an important topic you need to consider. The second is whether your existing platform is a closed or an open platform. Now, I hope I made clear that we believe that we should go for open platforms. So you should also go for open platforms. So that's an important topic you need to discuss and verify with your software provider. And the third is many solutions, accounting solutions, CRM solutions, choose what we call a single channel approach. So they can connect to the Peppol network, but if your supplier or if your customer is not on the Peppol network, then you cannot deliver an invoice to them or receive an invoice from them. Now, if your software provider is such a single channel provider and you also want to support, for example, integration with solutions like SAP, Oracle, etc., then you may require a tool that supports other channels also. So single channel versus multi-channel. So these are topics you need to discuss with your software providers. And then lastly, you have to talk with your buyers and your suppliers. Yeah. We got another question about why closed platforms are less successful than open platforms. At the beginning of the presentation, I talked about closed platforms. The data resides within the closed platform, and the only way to get it out is to manually entry it in other systems. So closed platforms are impossible, or at least very difficult to integrate with other platforms. So I hope that gives an answer to your question. So back to the collaboration part with your suppliers. What do you need to do with your suppliers? In many cases, we speak to companies and they say, no, the collaboration with our suppliers, we postpone that until we have integrated a e-invoicing solution or enabled it in our software. We believe that you should talk to your suppliers from the start, because it is very learnful experience to talk to them. And the first thing we advise you to do is segment your suppliers based on volume and process, and then establish what we call a coalition of the willing of high volume suppliers that are willing to work together with you on moving towards electronic invoicing. And the obvious reason that you focus on your high volume suppliers are that these are also the suppliers that provide you a quick win. So if they can move to electronic invoicing, you can move to like 30, maybe 40% of all your invoices electronically by onboarding these high volume suppliers. And then thirdly, and I already elaborated on this a bit, the communication strategy with your suppliers. This is also often a neglected topic, but it is important to provide your suppliers all the information they need to move with you on electronic invoicing. So, for example, what text on invoicing is in your terms and conditions, what's in your contracts, etc. So this is about collaborating with your buyers and your suppliers. Now, we have talked about electronic invoicing. We have talked about why it's important to adopt and how you can move forward. At the beginning, I talked a little bit about what tradeinterop is, but I like to spend some time about what tradeinterop does now that you know what electronic invoicing is. So tradeinterop helps companies with electronic invoicing. We are an e-invoicing service provider. We help you to connect your financial system with the system of your buyers and your suppliers. We are fully cloud-based, so you do not need to install any software on your own servers. It's easy to integrate and easy to use. So what you often see is that you have to adapt your internal system to e-invoicing services. We work the other way around. We adapt our e-invoicing services to your software so that it's easy to integrate for you. It's proven technology. Again, we use this technology by 3,000 customers across various industries and countries. In Europe, we have, for example, we have the Dutch police organization who uses our platform. Various government institutions use our platform. And the last, we often hear from our customer what they appreciate is our thought leadership. So we don't just sell them a technical capability, but we also advise them on how they can make the most out of electronic invoicing. And we also look with them how they can optimize processes around electronic invoicing, such as e-procurement. So that's what tradeinterop does. So in a visual, it looks like this. On the left side, there's your company with your business software. On the right side, there are your customers and your suppliers, governments, SMEs, large corporations, and we are in between connecting your software with their software via different ways. And Peppol is obviously, in our view, the most powerful way to do it. That brings me to the end of this presentation. I would like to summarize what we talked about. I think there are 3 important takeaways of this presentation, and I hope you take these 3 key points with you. And the first is electronic invoicing is inevitable. It is going to happen, and sooner rather than later, your customers and your suppliers will ask you about moving towards electronic invoicing. The second is Peppol is a global standard, and it's really, if you move into electronic invoicing, it's really important to adopt Peppol because that makes it a lot simpler for you. And the third takeaway is that implementation is not complex. The technology is available. It's not very difficult to implement, but it requires internal alignment. So you have to talk to finance, to procurement, and to ICT. You have to collaborate with your supplier, and you have to talk to your software to see if you can use existing software or you probably need new tools and new services. This brings me to the end of this presentation. I hope it contained a lot of things that were relevant for you that you can take with you to act on this very important development of electronic invoicing. If you have any further questions, feel free to ask them in the questions section or reach out to us via email. Feel free to send us an email. The email addresses are on the screen. And so this brings me to the end of this presentation. Thank you very much for listening in. I hope, again, it was useful for you, and hope to speak to you in the future. Thank you very much and have a good evening.